All right, let's dive into a really fascinating legal head scratcher. So, a marriage is over, the divorce is all signed and sealed, and everybody's supposed to just move on, right? But what if they don't? What happens if an accusation of abuse pops up after that legal relationship has already ended? It's a situation that brings up a very, very tricky question.
And this is the question at the heart of it all. I mean, it seems like it should be a simple yes or no, doesn't it? But, as we're about to find out from a real case that went all the way to the Bombay High Court, the answer is, well, it's anything but simple. It really comes down to what a relationship even means in the eyes of the law. Okay, let's take a look at this timeline because this is where the whole conflict really starts. You've got a marriage in 2003, a separation in 2006, and then a year later, November 3rd, 2007, the divorce is totally final. But notice that last entry. The domestic violence complaint was filed after all of that was official. This backwards-sounding sequence is what kicked off the entire legal battle.
So, let's get into the nitty-gritty here. This wasn't some abstract legal debate, nope. This was a real case with a very specific accusation that got dropped in front of the courts, forcing them to deal with this problem head-on. So what was it all about? Well, at the heart of the wife's claim of cruelty was a demand for money. She alleged that back when they were married, her husband and his family had demanded 100,000 rupees from her so they could go buy an Indica car. So after the divorce was a done deal, the wife came back with a two-part legal strategy. First, she filed a criminal complaint for cruelty under the Indian Penal Code. But second, and this is the part that really matters for our story, she filed a totally separate case under the Domestic Violence Act of 2005. In that one, she asked for a protection order and 10,000 rupees a month. And it was the second case, the one under the DV Act, that her ex-husband decided to fight. And this is where we get to the main event. The husband's challenge wasn't about whether the cruelty actually happened or not. No, his argument was way more fundamental than that. He basically claimed that since they were divorced, the Domestic Violence Act just couldn't apply to them anymore, period. This slide really lays out the two sides perfectly. The husband's argument was pretty straightforward. Hey, the DV Act is for protection. We don't live together, so there's no domestic relationship to protect. Case closed. But the wife's argument was basically, hold on, the abuse happened when we did have that relationship, and the law has to provide a way to get justice for that past harm. So the whole thing came down to the specific wording in the law itself. Section 2F of the Act says a domestic relationship is between two people who live or, and here's the magic phrase, have lived together in a shared home. The entire case was going to pivot on how the court decided to interpret those three little words. Exactly. Does that phrase, have lived together, cover any relationship you had in the past, no matter how long ago it ended? Or does it mean that some kind of domestic relationship has to still be going on, or at least have ended recently when you filed the complaint? This was the legal tightrope the court had to walk. And this brings us to the moment of truth, the 2009 verdict from the Bombay High Court. This was a really big deal, because it was going to set a major precedent for how this relatively new law was going to be used. You can feel the weight of this decision, right? It was going to determine if the protections of the Domestic Violence Act basically came with an expiration date that was stamped on your divorce decree. Could just the memory of a shared home, a relationship that legally didn't even exist anymore, be enough to trigger a law that was designed to protect people living inside that home? That was the million-dollar question. The court's answer was blunt and clear. They sided completely with the husband's interpretation. In this 2009 ruling, they said a past, already dissolved relationship was not enough to file a case under the Domestic Violence Act. And this quote from the judge, it really gets to the heart of their thinking. It's all about the present tense. The court's logic was, if there's no shared house right now, then there's no one to protect inside that house. To them, the law was a shield for an ongoing situation, not a weapon for a past one. So the court's reasoning really stood on four main pillars. First, there was no active domestic relationship. They hadn't lived together in over a year. Second, they saw the act's purpose as immediate protection, not settling old scores. Third, they pointed out that the wife had other legal options she could use. And finally, and this was a pretty big point, they hinted at mala fide intent, basically suggesting the timing seems suspicious, maybe more like an attempt to harass him than a real search for justice. But here's the thing. If you think the story ends there, in 2009, you'd be wrong. Because in law, one court ruling, even a high court ruling, is very rarely the final word on anything. That's right. The legal landscape isn't some ancient text carved in stone. It's a living, breathing thing. Interpretations get challenged, they get debated, and sometimes they get completely overturned by higher courts that see things differently. And this table just lays out that evolution perfectly. On the left, you've got that strict 2009 ruling. The relationship must be current, case closed. But then look at the right. Later, the Supreme Court took a much, much broader view. They reasoned that violence, especially economic abuse, leaves scars that don't just magically disappear when a divorce is finalized. They decided that the phrase has been had to be given its full weight, making sure victims couldn't be denied justice just because a piece of paper said the relationship was over. For them, the law's purpose was bigger than just immediate protection. It was about providing a real remedy for past wrongs. So what's the big takeaway from this whole legal roller coaster? Why does this one case from over a decade ago still have really important lessons for us today?
You know, this case really teaches us three big things about how the law works. One, the law is built on specific words, and at first, courts can interpret those words in a really strict, literal way. But two, the law isn't static. It changes. Judicial thinking evolves as society does. And that leads to the third and most important point. Any single court case is just a snapshot in time. It's a huge part of the conversation, but it's not always the final answer.
Which leaves us with this final, really powerful question. A divorce is supposed to be a clean break, the end of a chapter. But what happens when the echoes of that past relationship? Well, what happens when they demand justice? How does a legal system find the right balance between the need for closure and the moral duty to hold people accountable for their actions, even after the papers are all signed? It's a profound puzzle, and one our courts are still trying to solve.